right, let's call to order September 12th,
Recording in progress.
We'll call to order September 12th Planning Commissioning meeting. It's 6:30, I think 6:32. So our first order is Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, our first order of agenda is approval of the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda from last planning commission meeting in August.
Second.
All,
Mr. Chair, Planning Commissioners, this is approving this agenda.
yep.
Oh,
approving
the agenda. I thought the minutes.
I'm
Sorry.
Yeah,
My
it's
problem.
approval of the agenda for
Approving.
today. Okay.
I amend my motion.
Okay, got it.
Can I get a second?
Second.
All right, all four?
Aye.
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 All against? And then we're recording as an abstain.
I'm abstaining from the vote.
All right, so we'll move on to the next item. This is approval of the minutes from August 8th, 2023. Can I get a motion to approve?
Move to approve the minutes from August 8th, 2023.
Second.
All four?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All against?
I abstain.
Okay. All right, we have new business, and we have the revised application for 11490 Julian Avenue North. And do we have Jennifer?
Yes.
All right.
Good evening, members of the commission. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yep.
Yep, I see head shaking. That's perfect. First of all, thank you for letting me be here virtually this evening. I actually had a commitment prior to the meeting, so this works out perfectly. So before you this evening is the request to amend the conditional use permit for 11490 Julianne Avenue North. We took a look at this at our last meeting, so I don't have a very long presentation for you this evening, but I am going to go ahead and share my screen so we can walk through the materials that were presented to us between the last meeting and today. So with that, it looks like everybody should be able to see it. I can see your screen, so we're going to go ahead and jump in. So just as a reminder, if my screen will change, here we go. Just as a reminder, a brief summary of the request. So the applicant this evening is Jamie Benner. The property is zoned in A1. It's guided rural residential agricultural. It's about 37 acres, just shy of that. We are requesting an amendment to the conditional use permit. We talked about this last time. Most of the operations are proposed to remain the same as what they are currently operating under. What we're really primarily taking a look at this evening is the request to add the accessory building that we discussed at length at our last meeting. So we did hold our public hearing in September. It was September 12th, 2023. We did have a member of the public that did provide some public testimony in support of the request. And this evening, we are actually looking at some revised materials from the applicant. So if you'll recall from our September meeting, the Planning Commission asked for some additional information and some clarification with respect to the application. Those are the materials that have been submitted to us this evening. The Planning Commission requested materials really for consistency's sake to be updated. So it was really the narrative and then also the floor plans as part of the architectural planning set. So what we did receive back was a revised narrative, revised floor plan that went with our architectural plan. There was a landscape plan and a site plan that was presented to you. And then also the applicant did actually provide their proposed revisions to the conditional use permit that was issued in the 1990s. We don't typically actually as a commission take a look at that. So I provided it as reference because it was submitted by the applicant, but we don't actually do that part of the process here this evening. And then there also was a grading permit. Once again, typically the commission doesn't look at grading permits. However, this material was submitted, so I wanted to make sure that the package was complete. So as described in the narrative and as we discussed at the last meeting, the primary purpose of the amendment actually relates to the accessory building. It's approximately 720 square feet. The design of it is the same. It has not changed. It's an A-frame construction. What has changed is in the floor plan, the notations were updated to reflect the testimony that was provided by the applicant during our August meeting. And really a lower intensity use, I think, than what was originally understood based on the first narrative. So this information was updated. It does have the private office. There's a private, I would call it a semi-public restroom from the standpoint of the intent of that bathroom is actually for their clients also, but it is not necessarily for what's happening out at the horse, you know, in the riding arena, et cetera. It's really about that internal space. And once again, the proposed location is near the principal structure. The notation in the floor plan also does call out the one-on-one sort of, you know, private training, conference room, yoga studio area that was described by the applicant in their testimony in August. So in addition, the application does still contain the information regarding the update to the existing farmhouse, the addition area. We talked about this at the last meeting in terms of that's really not subject to the conditional use permit. That's something that would require a separate building permit. It's the principal structure, so it's really not addressed within the conditional use permit, nor would it be tonight, really, but it remains shown on the drawings for reference. The hydrotherapy facility or the pool that is also shown on the landscape plan and the site plan. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. And then also the clean energy improvements. Once again, those improvements aren't really identified. They're still described. Most of those things are likely perfectly acceptable and just would need to obtain the proper permitting at the time that those improvements are proposed. So for example, the solar panels would be subject to our ordinance, likely requires just a building permit depending on where they would be located. So a land was provided. This was extremely helpful, I think, to staff in terms of how the site would lay out or what they're contemplating. You can see by the rectangle just south of the sort of half moon or circular area, the bridle path, that is where the hydrotherapy pool would be proposed. As indicated in the narrative, this is just conceptual, but staff would note that if in the future that it were in this location and generally in this approximate size, orientation, et cetera, that provided that it is consistent with this, no separate amendment to the permit would be necessary, but if it does change substantially, there might be a need for an amendment to the permit. You can also see in this area that the extension to the house area is identified on the plan as well, which is on this case plan north on your page. And then you can also see where the proposed accessory building is located, which is on this particular orientation northwest of the principal structure. So from that perspective, this layout helped enormously to understand what the full build out plan is or contemplated for the site. So the architectural plans, the A-frame did not change. That is consistent. What did change is actually the notations on the floor plans now match up with what is provided in the narrative. So the narrative was also updated to reflect the testimony that was provided during the August meeting. And then also the floor plan now is consistent and labeled consistently. Click through that. So once again, the existing operations would remain no adjustments to the conditions that are stated within the existing Idlewood conditional use permit would change, except for those that are expressly related to this subject use or proposal. Obviously, the changes primarily relate to the new accessory building, and those are described in their narrative, which are now consistent with the floor plan. It does now consistently state that it's a private office, private restroom for use by the office. Again, I'd kind of classify that as semi-public. And then also a small conference yoga or teaching area. So there is now consistency between the plan set and the narrative that was submitted for your packets this evening. There is a reference in the narrative to it being, well, it was a little bit muddled in terms of whether or not they wanted to use it for dwelling. I heard from the applicant that they do not. It was just a statement that was put in the narrative. But because of that, and based on our conversation at the last meeting, staff recommend that we do include a condition within the CUP that states that this is not for living purposes. It is for the purposes that are described in the narrative, which are the private office, the one-on-one space, storage, etc. So from that perspective, I think it's important and prudent probably to document that as part of the conditional use permit process or amendment process. Some of the other items, again, that we addressed at the last meeting were noted again, which really are just subject to further permitting. We require a permit when it comes to our roof, solar panels, for example. Building permit would have to be obtained at the time that those are proposed. Those things remain valid. If they come back and there's something that requires separate permitting, then they would be subject to that. But without full plans, we can't really presuppose exactly what they're going to do or hypothesize. So from that perspective, most of the things that are described in the narrative would be acceptable, would just simply be things that are permitted and had to follow the proper procedures in the future when those plans are known. So there's basically two options for you this evening in terms of action. The first one is to recommend denial with findings. You would need to determine what those findings are this evening, or number two, recommend approval with conditions. There are a list of conditions that are drafted for your review this evening. The majority of them are based on both conversation from the Planning Commission at the last meeting, and then also based on the revised plans or submission that was provided in your packets this evening. So with that, it's a very brief presentation this evening. I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you. So I think it's back to us to discuss. So, any thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are just that I think the applicant has done some good work clarifying and some of our concerns we had, at least from some of my concerns. And I'm still have a question for all of us, for Jennifer. If we propose to recommend this to the council, is the language in the first bullet point under the recommended conditions, do you think, is that strong enough to prevent this from becoming used as a dwelling unit in the future? Does it need to expressly say not used as a dwelling unit? That's the bullet point that says the construction of the new approximately 720 square foot accessory building is permitted. The use of the building must be for these things. Do we need to add in there and not to be used as a dwelling unit? So it's expressly.
That's one of her conditions, number C, in the recommendation there.
Thank you for finding it. Thank you. I was like, I believe I wrote it. It is condition C. It states the accessory building may not be used as a dwelling unit.
Okay, I thought I had read it online, but when I was reading through these bullet points, I didn't see it. So where was that?
Page 18
Oh.
of the PDF,
I didn't get far enough in.
page 4 of her report. There's conditions A through L.
Yep, I did read it. Sorry, I was on the wrong place. I was looking too far.
There we go.
I wasn't far enough into the report. I knew I had read it online, and when I got here and looked at the actual report in print, I didn't see it, so, I don't know what everyone else thinks, but that was my main issue. And the only other question I have for Jennifer is the things that we're just kind of, they don't have given us plans for, like building the house larger or the hydrotherapy. You say in here that, you know, these aren't approved, they're generally acceptable now, that if they come forward with a building permit for those things, they generally wouldn't need to amend the CUP. What happens if our ordinances change in, let's say, 10 years, and they come forward to apply for these things? Will they be able to look back to this document and say that this document allows them to do that?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, no. They're basically going to be subject to the permitting that's in place at the time that they make their application. So if they make an application for a building permit, for example, and the building permit reveals that based on ordinances that are in place at that time, that there's a separate permit that's required, whether it's a conditional use permit amendment or a certificate of compliance or whatever it might be, they'll be subject to that, because this basically is saying you submitted these things under our current ordinances. They look generally acceptable, but you're going to be subject to whatever permitting is in place at the time. So if we amend something that would then require it to have a conditional use permit, they would be required to amend.
Thank you.
Yeah, my comfort is, I have comfort with the conditions listed. That's where my head's at.
Yeah, it matches, the narrative matches the plans, and the big question answered is that not a dwelling unit, this accessory building, so I'm comfortable with the conditions and moving ahead with the recommendation to council.
All right, can I get a
May I make
motion
that
to
a
move
motion?
it forward? Can you make it a motion?
I'll make a motion to, where did she put it? Here it is. Approval of the amended CUP, subject to conditions A through L in the planner's report.
I second the motion.
All four?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed?
I abstain.
So noted. So we move on to our next order of business, which I believe is outdoors.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners,
Oh,
I'll
yes.
just note that this item will be on the October City Council meeting agenda.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. All right, we have old business. Draft ordinance of outdoor storage.
See if I can get on the right page this time.
I'm trying to find all my pages too, so I understand. So Jennifer, is there a recap? I saw corrections and what was sent out and some adjustments.
Right, so thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. So based on our conversation that we had at the last meeting, I did go ahead and prepare another, a second round of the draft ordinance. I'm actually going to go ahead and just share my screen. I didn't actually prepare a presentation for this one. I just think it's easier if we take a look at the ordinance itself and walk through a couple of the changes. The changes, obviously, as we discussed this at the last meeting, there was actually, I think there was quite a bit of agreement, but there was also a how are we going to accomplish this, and a little bit of discussion that went back and forth. So this was sort of my next stab at how we might address some of these topics. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try to zoom this in a little bit just because I can tell from, I went the opposite way. That's not the way we want to go. Let me see. All right, that might be a little bit better. So the first thing that I did is actually took another set of edits to the definitions, because if you recall from our last meeting, there was a little bit of conversation between what does personal outdoor storage mean versus commercial outdoor storage. And the more I dug into it, it turns out that actually is a very complicated question. And so the way I went about it based on our conversation was actually to say that personal outdoor storage is if you're storing your own personal products or, vehicles, materials, equipment, et cetera, on the site. If you're storing somebody else's stuff that's not yours, that trips it into the commercial realm. And obviously, as we go through the rest of the ordinance, that doesn't necessarily mean they need any kind of permit. It's just trying to make a distinction between those things. There was some discussion about, well, if there's money that transacts, is that what trips it into commercial? And it really got complicated. So I went for this next round for feedback. I went with if you're storing somebody else's stuff, it's not personal, essentially, is kind of the dividing line that I put in. So then on the second page, there was some general comfort, it seemed, with the table of uses. I left that as is for now in terms of the discussion. At the moment, we've got, just as a reminder, we've got outdoor storage. When it's a principal use, it is not permitted in any of the districts unless it is in the general business district. So this idea is obviously that if you're in one of our GB parcels, that outdoor storage as a primary use or a principal use would be accepted, but it's really not accepted anywhere else. The question would be whether we want that as a conditional use or whether we want it as an interim use permit. I think that there's merit to both ways. Obviously, part of the benefit of potentially exploring an interim use permit is that you truly can tie it to the user as opposed to the property. So it wouldn't go on into perpetuity. It would really align with a specific user and their operations. So something to consider, but obviously I think it might be worth considering at least going the interim use permit angle. So likewise with outdoor storage commercial, once again, remember this is if you're taking somebody else's stuff. I left the money part out of it, but if it's not just your stuff, but you're taking someone else's stuff and storing it on your property, that it would actually require an interim use permit. Based on our conversation the last time, there was some discussion about, well, if I have 5 friends and I take their stuff and put it on my property, is that okay? And there was sort of well, maybe if you can't see it, maybe if it's not too much, so we kind of went back and forth a little bit. The thought is if you have to get an interim use permit, then there would be a way of actually saying, well, sure, you can store, 5 of your friends' things, but it has to be buffered. It has to be screened. There's an interim use permit. Once again, it's tied to the user as opposed to the use or to the property. So it doesn't last into perpetuity. It's really based on a specific user. So then outdoor storage personal as an accessory use to a permitted principal use. So think about it as it's a single family residence using the property for rural residential uses. We have the exceptions, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Anything beyond those exceptions, they would require a certificate of compliance. Once again, the personal is that it's your stuff. You're not taking it for 5 of your buddies. It's your stuff. I realize I'm being very simplistic in the way I'm talking about it, but trying to make it as easy as possible because it's complicated, as we learned at our last discussion. So then some adjustments to the language related to the performance standards themselves. So obviously there's some general statements that would apply to all of it, whether it's personal or commercial. One of the things that we talked about last time was that we're not going to require necessarily the area to be on an improved surface, for example. So I took that language out and I did add it back in when it relates specifically to a commercial use that doesn't meet the exception, but it's not a general standard. So if it's personal use, that's not a requirement. And then we get into some of the buffering and screening stuff later on as well. So that's removed. So there's basically these kind of upfront requirements that apply to all outdoor storage except for those exceptions. So we talked a little bit about adding in an exception for agricultural uses. So I added that into into the language to say that if it's an agricultural use, it's something in active agricultural, which could, by the way, also be just a hobby farm. It's not necessarily like a mass commercial scale agricultural production, and any agricultural equipment, that is an exception to this ordinance. That's not what we're trying to regulate here. So then in terms of personal outdoor storage, this is, again, there, I think at the last meeting, we had a little bit of discussion about, and maybe even a little bit of confusion about the fact that the outdoor storage is only permitted if there's a acceptable principal use. So like for personal, for example, your residential use of a property is the principal use. Your ability to store your stuff is the accessory use. And then there's these exceptions of what doesn't get tripped in, and anything above and beyond that is what we're really talking about here. That would be subject to the requirements. And so the exceptions got a little bit brought. I added some in based on our conversation at the last meeting. So the exceptions would be any vehicles parked in the primary driveway. We talked about how, people who have 3 teenagers, there might be 5 cars. That's not really what we're talking about for this ordinance. So instead of adding a number here, I just said if it's parked in the driveway and it's licensed and roadworthy, that's accepted from the standard. Personal vehicles that are stored in a designated storage area, provided they're licensed and roadworthy. So this is if you had more vehicles, but you were parking them in another area. Those are an exception, but they have to be in a side or a rear yard, and outside all setbacks. So you can't park it on your neighboring property line, for example. Recreational vehicles, we talked a little bit about this. We actually already have a section in the code that references it. It's 32-339. Not to open a can of worms, but that section of the code is actually maybe not exactly how you'd like to see that written, but at the moment, those are our regulations about where recreational vehicles can be stored. And then also accepted would be utility trailers, horse trailers, or similar. Once again, these are personal trailers, personal horse trailers, for example. These are not if you're storing them for someone else. So then jumping into the commercial. So again, this is somebody else's stuff that someone is storing. Then that's where we'd trip in the requirements of that you must have it fully screened. If you're going to store, 5 of your buddies' horse trailers in a designated area, that area has to be screened. The storage area would have to be in a designated area so we can take a look at it to make sure it complies with the ordinance and it's outside of the setbacks. In this case, if you're going to do this and store it for other people, that's when maybe we trip in the improved surface. So if it's your own stuff, you don't have to do that. If you're doing it for other buddies, then maybe you should have to do it. But I'm throwing that out there for discussion based on the last meeting. And then lastly, the table, we kind of went back and forth on whether 20 acres was the right size. For discussion purposes tonight, I put it at 10 acres. For A1 and A2. I actually left it higher in the R1, thinking that perhaps that's, those are more compact lots. There are a few that are bigger, but the idea being really that we wouldn't really want to promote commercial outdoor storage in any of those areas. And then obviously left general business at 30,000. So that is my next attempt to capture everything we talked about at the last meeting. And so with that, I will turn it back over to you for discussion.
Thank you. I had something circled here, Jennifer, and I was just wondering, it was under number 3, under the section on outdoor storage where it says refuse and weeds. How are we defining weeds? There's weeds everywhere. That's a tough statement to it seems like there should be more like maintenance of weeds or something related to that versus,
Just strike it out. and not
yeah,
worry
or
about
strike
weeds.
it out.
They're everywhere.
Yeah.
I actually believe that's in your current ordinance right now.
Is it really? Okay.
And I agree, or I'd be in big trouble at my house too. Weeds are, they have a mind of their own.
They're everywhere. That's hard
So-
to define that.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
So,
yeah.
you know, well, first, Jennifer, I'd like to say thank you for all the work you've done on this. And taking into consideration all the things we talked about last meeting. I appreciate the changes and the additions and everything. That said, I'm still kind of the mind that it's hard for me to imagine that this is necessary in Grant. I know the council has directed you to work on this. My personal feelings is kind of we're chasing a problem that doesn't really exist. Maybe it exists on some businesses that want to start up storing things in the general business district as commercial storage. But other than that, on the residential side, I just kind of think this is going to be a big change for the residents of Grant that may be a gotcha moment for some of them. I know we've exempted the agriculture and some of the other things, but I think this is going to be a big change. People are moved out to the country to get away from this kind of regulation, and now it's coming back. Maybe it's a sign of the times and the fact that the community is growing, but that's my general thought on the whole thing. That said, my personal opinion would be that outdoor storage commercial should maybe not be conditional use permit. It should be interim use permit so that we have more control of tying that to the business that's located at the site and not allowing that particular storage use to happen in perpetuity with the land. That's my thought there. But, you know, that's a tough one too, because we've got businesses that sell agricultural and like landscape commodities, gravel and rock and stone and that stuff all stored outside. And that's probably part of their CUP, and it's probably been that way for a long time, and it's probably fine. There's businesses that have peak seasons that store agricultural commodities outside, that store animal feed outside, animal bedding. So I just think that we need to be careful that the existing businesses can mostly do what they're doing unless it's causing a nuisance, and that we're not causing a huge change for residents.
So one thing I will say to the existing conditional use permits, this will not apply to anyone who's in compliance with their existing CUP. So this won't be a retroactively, we're not tacking this on. So I know some of those businesses that you're talking about, this wouldn't be like, we're going to go out and tell them now they need a new permit. They have obviously protected rights under that conditional use permit, provided that they are following their CUPs. This will not affect them.
Yeah, and I wasn't insinuating that it would. I just kind of thinking forward to the next business that wants to be just like that, right? Next door to them, and how is it gonna impact them? And some of these businesses, good businesses that have been here, maybe we want more like that. Maybe we don't, I don't know. But I think not having it a CUP would be a good way to go, so that we can tie the use to the operator of the business. And if they're a good operator, there's no problems. If someone else comes in and they're not a good operator, the permit can go away. That's my thought. That's my thoughts.
Well, I think you did a good job incorporating what we talked about last meeting, for sure. Any thoughts on your side?
I agree with the, being an interim use, so there's a little more control there.
I agree, yeah, I immediately circled that as interim also. Any other thoughts on wording? I think there is a general agreement about, restricting Grant. This is a big step in a direction, and I think it's a valid attempt to do it. But I do share some of the same concerns that you had.
One thing I would like to just kind of interject is, I don't think, or at least my understanding from the council is, this really isn't aimed at people storing their own stuff. Which is why I think the way that the second draft is developed is much more clear, that there's not going to be, staff driving around looking for opportunities to enforce, someone's personal storage of their stuff, which is why, like, accepting the utility trailers, the personal vehicles, the intent here is certainly not that. I think the intent is really, and where we've faced a couple of issues, is really more about people doing this in some ways in a more commercial way and storing other people's stuff, and having large quantities of it. And that's really what it's aimed at. So I don't think it's, unless Kim feels different, but to me, this is absolutely not about, telling people that they can't have their trailers or can't have their vehicles, or so I think those changes that you asked for at the last meeting make that much clearer from my perspective. So for what it's worth.
Personal is definitely cleaned up and written, I think, appropriately from my perspective. Any other thoughts? Kim, what are you looking for from us with this today? Are we recommending this to move
Mr. Chair and
forward?
Commissioners, just any comments that you would like for Jennifer to incorporate into a draft? But then, yes, a recommendation to the City Council on what you see before you.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts on,
I had one more, or a couple more things. One question, Jennifer, I think you covered it, but in, right after recreational vehicles, you had utility trailers, horse trailers, and similar. How does a farm with other people's trailers fall? Would that use, those other trailers fall under the farm use versus storing them for your buddy, like you say? I think it's several stables where they have multiple trailers, they don't own them all, but it's a farm use that those trailers are there.
So most of our stable facilities already have a conditional use permit. So I think a lot of those would actually fall under that, to be honest. I do think potentially, depending on how many of those that they're storing, it actually might fall into the commercial category. I do think it might be a little bit on a case-by-case basis, to be perfectly honest. If you're storing 2 or 3 other trailers and you have 50 acres or 40 acres, I don't think anybody is ever going to look at it or think twice about it. I think it would be more like, all of a sudden there's a property that's storing 100 trailers for someone, and then that, I think, would trip more into the commercial and wouldn't actually be part of the exception. So like all ordinances, I think there's a little bit of gray area that could occur depending on the what if scenario. I think the couple, someone storing a couple of trailers, I doubt A, that anybody's ever going to notice, but also B, that would, I think, follows under the intent of the exceptions.
Okay, thank you.
any thoughts on the acreage that's defined on the 3rd page or 4th page? 4th?
I think the 20 acres under the residential kind of eliminates the lion's share of the residential lots are being considered, so I think that's fine.
Yeah, I don't know that we want to encourage commercial storage on a residential lot. I guess the only holdup there would be, a one-man in a truck electrician storing a couple of things outside, but, those businesses are usually pretty neat and tidy anyway, or have a pole barn or something, so.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know, I think it's hard for me to get behind any of it, but
Yeah.
it's a good second draft. I know the council's gonna have lots of opinions, so I don't
I think
I don't know if there's a whole lot more we can do. We've kind of,
no.
I've spoken my piece.
Well, it's more the, feeling and the whether, I think the effort is very valiant trying to put boundaries
Yep.
around it. So
Yeah, it's just,
I think our recommendation though would be to go to interim on the outdoor storage, commercial and personal in general business.
yep.
And then the other one would be just just a comment on weeds, how to define that better or
Mr. Chair,
remove it.
Commissioners, I do sincerely apologize. I thought that you guys had closed the public hearing for the draft ordinance. You did not. Jennifer, wasn't that your recollection as well?
I think we may have left it open.
But it is open, if you want to open public comment.
Sure.
For the minutes.
Yeah, I didn't, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, is it,
Might as
need a
well.
motion to,
I'll move to open public comment, reopen public comment.
you get a second?
Second.
All four?
Aye.
All right.
Aye. Any nays?
I abstain.
Thank you. So public hearing is open. Any comments?
This thing. Does it work?
We can hear you. You don't have to sign in either.
Okay. Terry Helander, 6261 Jasmine Avenue North. I guess I just want to reinforce Dave's comments there with mine. I've lived in Grant a long time. We are not what Pine Tree Hills or a congested community. We're a mixture of residential and rural properties. And if you drive through the city of Grant, you see the wide variety of things. There are some neighborhoods with small lots like I live in, but then there are a lot of farms or large lots that have a combination of maybe woods and fields and yes, weeds, whatever it is. Some of it's pretty wild stuff. And I think most of the people that live here, and they've lived here a long time, accept their neighbors for what they are and are responsible for their own properties and not their neighbors' properties. And I see things from time to time in my neighborhood that I say, well, that's not exactly what I would do in my yard, but I don't go pound on their door and say, I want you to have your yard like my yard. And I'm sure there's some neighbors that don't really appreciate my yard with its weeds the way it is either, you know, but we tolerate each other and get along fine. Now, there are some people that want to have a perfect yard, and I think those are maybe mostly the newcomers that buy a big piece, but to build something nowadays, you have to have your at least 5 acres and maybe 10. And if you want to live that way, then I guess you can buy that parcel, and in the middle of it, you can make your perfect yard where you can't see anything in the neighborhood and be happy with it. But you don't have to change your neighbors in the process. So I don't want to see Grant to become another suburb city of small lots that are at least with that attitude for what you can do and what you can't do in your yard. I really want to see that freedom continue that we have. In driving around tonight, and I made a fairly short circuit, I drove about 5 miles or so, and I'm looking critically in people's yards, and I was really impressed by how people take care of their things. And yeah, there might be something you see out in our yard that, well, yeah, that maybe wouldn't be there if you had a tightened up ordinance, but I really don't want to see that ordinance come our way. I think we should leave things pretty well alone. I don't know that there's a major problem with people having a multitude of things stored on their property for their friends and it being a problem. If there is, you know, and becomes a commercial thing, I guess that problem could be addressed, but for the most part, I'd just like to leave things the way they are. If you come out with changes to the ordinance, at the least you're gonna cause a lot of concern by people that something's changed and are they gonna be doing something different to us? I think we should leave well enough alone. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comment? We don't have anyone online.
No, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, we can close now.
All right.
Good news is that I had it right in the minutes, so.
We
I'll
got-
move to close the public hearing.
All right.
Second.
All for?
Aye.
All against?
Abstain.
Thank you. All right, public hearing is closed. So,
Mr. Chair,
yes,
I just want to make one comment about the weeds, just because there seems to be a little bit of confusion. The first is it's already in your ordinance, and the second is that the statement is actually only about vacant land. So this isn't about going and policing existing residential properties and their weeds that exist. It's only about the statement is the owner of vacant land shall be responsible for keeping such land free of refuse and weeds. So I just want to make that clarification, because if anybody's watching this, I don't want them to get concerned that suddenly we're going to start enforcing a weed policy of some kind. That's not what the statement is about. So
Thank you.
I just had one more thought, and that's kind of partially a question for you, Jennifer, and just partly a thought, is that, I mean, there are some areas, if I recall, that have been developed more recently perhaps, that have new developments with homeowners associations and that sort of thing. Is that correct? And they have a multitude of rules and regulations perhaps to govern how people keep their properties in those newer developments. Is that true?
that's correct. Several of them do have private covenants.
Yeah. So there, I mean, there's a, like our, like Jerry was saying when he came up for public comment, is that there's a multitude of different types of properties in Grant. And one option that is there is if you want to live in a property with covenants and very restrictive rules on what you can and cannot do, that's there for you. So.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, I just will note on that thought, the city has absolutely nothing to do with enforcing the covenants.
Yeah, but that's, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the homeowner association do. but
Yes,
that's-
absolutely. So if a complaint were to come in on one of those properties, that's nothing the city enforces.
Yeah. I understand that.
Any other thoughts from up here? So we have essentially a choice to move it forward as a recommendation, or,
I have a question on the point of order.
yeah.
How many votes do we need to pass something to the council? Or will this go to the council without a recommendation?
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, it should go to the, it would go with a 2-1 vote, a 1-2, it should go to the city council. Per my notes, what I have is that the only kind of revision you guys discussed was putting the interim use on the,
Yep.
Yes.
okay, that's the only change that I have, so I think that, now that that's clarified, you could make a recommendation based on that revision, that information to Jennifer.
Do I have a recommendation?
I'll make a motion that we leave well enough alone and do not recommend this to the changes to the city council despite Jennifer's good work.
Mr. Chair and
just-
Commissioners, for clarification, that would be recommend denial.
Okay.
Recommend denial would be that.
Thank you.
Okay. And what would be the state beyond that, Kim? Would it go back for further rewrites, or where are we?
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, this will go forward to the council.
Okay. All right. With that, do I have a recommendation?
Yeah, you have a motion. Need a
Yeah, a
second?
motion. Yep, a motion to,
I made a motion.
sorry, I missed it. Motion to recommend it for
No,
denial.
yeah, motion to recommend to deny.
Okay. Do I have a second?
Second.
All four?
Aye.
Nay? All nay?
Abstain.
Okay. So we have a recommendation for denial.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, is it just, because that was unanimous, 3-0 with an abstention to deny, is it a fair statement to say that you don't want a new ordinance whatsoever? You want to keep it, the storage ordinance as is?
That would be my intention. I don't think it needs to come here again. If the city council wants to do something, they're obviously
They're entitled.
they're entitled to do that, right? But
No, I just wanted a statement
Yeah.
regarding your reasoning, that's
Yeah.
all. I'm not arguing, I'm not disagreeing,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, very much
That's a fair
that, so.
statement for all of you?
Very fair.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, the last order of business would be to adjourn. Unless there's any, are we good? Okay, all right. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
I'll move to adjourn the meeting.
Second,
All for?
Aye.
All against? And,
And the same.
all right, meeting's closed. Thank you.
thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too.